The permit file described nothing unusual. A routine foundation excavation, a municipal redevelopment, parcel cleared months earlier, soil reports, stamped and archived. That was where my attention stayed at first, on paperwork rather than earth, on approvals rather than outcomes. Cleveland has been rebuilt too many times to treat every dig as revelation. Pipes surface, old footings appear, brick foundations from forgotten storefronts crumble into dust and get carted away without ceremony. What interrupted that rhythm was not spectacle, but hesitation. Work crews stopped cutting downward. Surveyors rechecked depths that already matched their projections. A section of compacted fill resisted tools meant to slice through glacial clay. The material behaved differently, too ordered, too deliberate, a kind of resistance that suggests previous planning rather than geological accident. Municipal diagrams showed nothing beneath the lot. No sublevels, no retained structures, no buried utilities that might justify the anomaly. Just blank strata extending down through decades of redevelopment. Someone muttered that the blueprints were wrong. Someone else shrugged. I asked for the measurements anyway. They came back neat, clean, symmetrical, and suddenly the ground beneath a quiet block no longer felt empty. The numbers arrived first, scribbled on laminated clipboards, transferred into spreadsheets that normally tracked nothing more dramatic than trench depth and footing clearance. I scanned them without expectation. Length, width, elevation, coordinates cross-referenced to a grid the city had used for decades. Then I read them again. The void beneath the lot was not irregular, not collapsed, not the chaotic cavity of an old basement crushed by time. Its edges resolved into straight lines, right angles, distances that repeated when measured from different points. Survey rods dropped and stopped at the same depth across multiple passes. Laser levels confirmed it, 10 feet, then 12, then another vertical face that should not have been there at all. The inspectors did not raise their voices. They recalibrated instruments instead, ran checks twice, 3 times. One engineer requested a second transit from the truck. Another traced chalk lines along exposed soil, following contours that refused to curve. No one said much. Paperwork began to accumulate faster than explanations. Structural tolerances from surrounding buildings did not match what lay beneath them. The orientation cut across known property lines. Utility maps showed nothing occupying that space. Historical redevelopment records skipped directly from 19th century grading to 20th century infill, as if the ground had remained undisturbed in between. It hadn't. I watched a technician pause mid-calculation, stare at a column of figures, then quietly reset his calculator and start over. The second set came out identical. Routine measurements were supposed to confirm expectations. These were dismantling them. Once the debris was cleared enough to expose edges rather than cavities, the geometry changed again. Rectangular openings began to surface along one wall, their outlines emerging where compacted soil had been shaved away by hand tools rather than machinery. The shapes were too deliberate to ignore. Vertical sides, horizontal lintels, corners that held instead of collapsing. Door frames, not decorative arches, not ornamental masonry, functional apertures cut into load-bearing stone. I waited for someone to laugh it off. No one did. Measuring tape stretched upward and stopped short. A second was added, then a third. The heights exceeded what utility corridors required, exceeded what 19th century basements usually allowed, exceeded what modern code would ever authorize beneath a residential block. An engineer crouched near the base, ran gloved fingers along the threshold, then stood and shook his head without elaboration. Records were requested. City permit logs, renovation filings, demolition reports from previous decades, anything that explained why structural openings large enough to swallow a freight elevator had been sealed and forgotten. Beneath successive rebuilds, nothing addressed them directly. Archivists combed through microfilm rolls, building officials paged through yellowed plats that tracked sewer reroutes and property transfers with obsessive precision, while leaving these voids untouched. No annotations, no amendments, no engineering justifications tucked into appendices, The silence was precise, too precise. These doors had not been built to impress. They had been built to be used, and now they were waiting under a neighborhood that had no memory of them at all. I shifted away from the excavation site and toward filing cabinets that smelled faintly of dust and toner. Pat maps from the early 20th century showed nothing beneath the lot. Earlier survey grids were equally clean, the parcel rendered as a blank rectangle bordered by alleys that had since been renamed twice. Property transfers were recorded down to the inch. Ownership traced through corporations that dissolved and reassembled across decades. Yet every document assumed the ground beneath had remained undisturbed. It hadn't. Sanborn fire insurance maps contradicted zoning overlays by a few feet. 19th century grading reports describe fill where stone now sat. Sewer reroute schematics bent around empty space they never labeled. One archive referenced a subsurface obstruction without specifying location, dimensions, or resolution. Plaques scroll through microfilm in silence. Historians flagged margins with pencil marks, but declined to speculate. Offices forwarded requests to other offices, each insisting the answer existed somewhere else. Every version of the city agreed on streets. They did not agree on what lay beneath them. The doors were real. The paperwork behaved as though they weren't. Phone calls began to loop. One office redirected me to another. Another promised callbacks that never came. Requests were logged, stamped, filed into queues that seemed engineered for slow motion rather than response. Digital portals displayed polite confirmations and no attachments. Physical archives produced boxes missing the folders they were supposed to contain. Nobody refused outright. That was the part that lingered. A zoning clerk shrugged when asked about sublevels that never appeared in redevelopment records. A municipal engineer scanned a database, frowned, and suggested the data might have been migrated incorrectly during a software upgrade years earlier. A records supervisor admitted some microfilm reels had degraded before they were fully digitized. Forms replaced explanations. The paper trail I had followed from excavation pit to blueprint drawer thinned into margins and ellipses. Notes ended mid-sentence. Index cards pointed toward collections that no longer existed under the same classification. Numbers. Entire decades collapsed into administrative gray zones. I stopped expecting answers and started counting delays instead. They accumulated with the same precision as the door frames underground. The structures had survived being buried. Their documentation had not, and that imbalance felt deliberate in ways no form could admit. Once the Cleveland files began thinning into silence, I stopped treating the anomaly as isolated. Patterns only reveal themselves when you widen the frame. Municipal archives from river cities in the Midwest produced the same structural oddities buried beneath redevelopment zones. Oversized entryways documented briefly in engineering logs, then excluded from final renovation plans. Sublevels omitted from updated cadastral maps. Foundation depths that exceeded the needs of the buildings. They supported by margins no contemporary architect could justify. In one case, a contractor's preliminary survey listed vaulted masonry beneath a warehouse slated for demolition. The final permit package contained no mention of it. In another, inspectors recorded load-bearing stonework at depths inconsistent with the recorded construction date of the street above it. Their notation vanished from the version submitted to City Council. Different cities, different decades, identical administrative outcomes. Requests followed the same path I had already learned to recognize: deferred, redirected, logged without follow-up. Departments cited jurisdictional overlap. Agencies recommended inquiries be filed elsewhere. Historical societies acknowledged the existence of early reports but could not locate the supporting materials. The repetition was precise, not theatrical, not confrontational, procedural. Construction crews appeared only in first drafts. Inspectors surfaced in marginal annotations. Unnamed agencies absorbed responsibility without leaving fingerprints. What remained were redevelopment approvals that treated subterranean structures as if they had never existed at all. Coincidence becomes harder to sustain when it replicates this cleanly. I began aligning timelines instead of addresses. Late 19th century street expansions, early 20th century utility retrofits, mid-century demolitions. Each period left brief shadows of architectural contradictions before the record corrected itself. The same absences, the same vanishing measurements, and the same calm bureaucratic gravity pulling everything back into line. The doors themselves suggested more than unusual proportions. Their frames were not decorative arches or ornamental thresholds meant to impress. The masonry beneath them behaved like structural anchors, load-bearing, reinforced, designed to redirect pressure downward into sublevels that no longer appeared on modern plans. I turned to the documents instead of speculation. Surveyor notes from early 20th century inspections describe foundation courses composed of stone types, not quarried locally during that period. Brick dimensions deviated from standardized industrial molds that had already become common by the 1870s. Mortar samples, lobbed decades later during infrastructure upgrades, showed mineral blends inconsistent with municipal construction manuals of the era. One report paused over a keystone whose compression profile implied a doorway height far above street level at the time of installation. Another referenced iron reinforcement, embedded at intervals rarely used outside of bridge supports. Nothing in those pages announced itself as impossible. That was what unsettled me. The techniques were coherent, deliberate, expensive, the sort of decisions made by engineers working from full schematics rather than improvisation. Yet when I searched for those schematics, they were absent. No blueprints archived under city engineering departments. No permit filings describing the excavation of substructures capable of supporting that kind of vertical stress. No correspondence between planners discussing why such doorways would be required beneath residential streets. Only the physical consequences remained. Materials placed with intention, forces accounted for, architectural solutions without architectural memory. The pattern had shifted again. It was no longer just that the doors were buried. It was that they had been built properly, and nobody seemed able to show who had designed them. Engineering anomalies can linger for decades. Sealing them requires action. Redevelopment schedules became my next anchor. Street widening projects, sewer installations, transit expansions, post-war housing booms, each left layers beneath the city. Strata of concrete and gravel added in the name of progress. Paperwork followed those projects meticulously. Budgets, environmental reviews, safety waivers, excavation depths measured to the inch, which made the emissions harder to treat as oversight. At several Cleveland sites, fill material appeared far thicker than engineering standards required for routine resurfacing. Subgrade reports listed imported soil volumes inconsistent with simple utility trenching. One urban renewal filing noted structural remnants encountered before pivoting to cost overruns and accelerated schedules. No follow-up descriptions, no diagrams, no amended architectural surveys. The planning board minutes referenced delays, emergency approvals, temporary closures of adjacent blocks. The language remained procedural, drained of curiosity, as though whatever lay beneath had already been categorized before. Anyone thought to ask what it was? I tracked permit numbers across decades and found discontinuities. Applications archived without attachments. Inspection reports cross-referencing annexes that were no longer stored with the originals. Regulatory pathways that ended abruptly once fill was poured and pavement replaced. Nobody appeared to intervene, which felt stranger than intervention. Covering something that large requires coordination, even when no one admits to coordinating. Trucks must arrive. Crews must work overnight. Materials must be purchased. Schedules altered. Municipal signatures recorded. Cities do not bury architecture by accident. They bury it through paperwork, and the paperwork, in these cases, had learned how to forget. By the time I reached that stage of the investigation, the individual anomalies no longer mattered. The doors, the foundations, the missing blueprints, the redevelopment filings that stopped short of description. Taken alone, each could be explained through routine failure, a lost folder, a clerical shortcut, an engineer deciding not to record something that seemed irrelevant in the moment. Together, they formed something heavier. Maps contradicted excavation logs, inspection reports referenced attachments that no longer existed. Archive indexes pointed toward collections that had been reorganized without leaving cross-references behind. The more methodical the record-keeping appeared, the more conspicuous its blind spots became. What unsettled me was not the presence of contradiction. It was the absence of curiosity. No follow-up memos asking why vaults had been encountered beneath residential blocks. No correspondence debating whether historical classifications should be revised. No internal disputes preserved in meeting minutes. The system behaved as though every discrepancy had already been resolved before anyone wrote it down, or as though the question itself had been removed. I began laying documents side by side instead of reading them sequentially. Dates aligned in uncomfortable ways. Burials of substructures clustered around periods of aggressive urban expansion. Record gaps widened in the same decades across multiple departments. The weight did not come from what was written. It came from what had failed to survive between the lines. History is usually loud about disruption. Here, it had learned how to go quiet. And that silence had shape. By then, the investigation had stopped moving forward in lines. It had begun circling. The same architectural contradictions surfaced wherever modern pavement met 19th century soil. Oversized thresholds, vaulted stone. Reinforcement buried beneath residential blocks with no surviving rationale. The same administrative thinning followed close behind. Missing annexes, revised maps, permits that closed cases without recording what had been encountered. Nothing in the process required malice. That was what made it difficult to dismiss. Systems erase as efficiently through indifference as through intent. Paper decays, classifications change, databases overwrite. Whole categories of material fall between jurisdictions that were never designed to preserve questions, yet the structures endured. They remained under asphalt in basements, under subway tunnels and utility corridors, exerting quiet pressure on the narratives built above them. Cleveland was not an exception anymore. It was an entry point. The doors were still there, sealed, measured, unaccounted for, and until someone produces the plans that explain why they were built, or the records that show when they were buried, they remain what the archives refuse to resolve. Physical facts waiting beneath official silence.